Okay. So I decided to, oh yeah, anyways, Sabina Spielrein's essay, Destruction as the Cause of Becoming, discusses motherhood and why women choose to, and asks why women choose to become mothers, despite the destructiveness of motherhood on individual women, which he says in the quote that the fetus develops at the expense of the mother like a malignant tumor. Spielrein's essay can be used to present destruction or trauma as a creative force. We see Spielrein's view of the creativity of destruction in the quotes that she uses from Nietzsche, where he says that whoever must give birth is sick, and that the creative ones will have to become mothers. Spielrein also quotes passages from Nietzsche in which he argues that the human being is something to be overcome so that the overman can come about. He also makes a statement that if there is no ladder for you to climb up, you have to climb on top of your own head. Spielrein relates this to motherhood, arguing that you must destroy yourself in order to create the higher, the child, in the same way that Nietzsche creates the overman or Übermensch by overcoming the self, or overcoming or destroying the self. We see here not only the presentation of destruction as a creative force, but also some kind of redemption through this creativity, which we see when Nietzsche says that things like that is how the overman comes about, and through Spielrein's calling of the child the higher. Next up is Brison's narrative self. In a work, Outliving Oneself, Brison argues that traumatized are not the same person as I would lost myself as I was, which suggests that they're a different person before and after the traumatic event. These statements and the effect that traumatic events have on the memory disrupt the usual philosophical view of the self as a set of continuous memories, an ongoing narrative. So instead of one continuous narrative, Brison presents an image of the self being made up of a series of successive selves. Brison argues that since the self is created in relation to others, a trauma can break a person's continuous narrative, as it destroys their fundamental assumptions about the world and a person's place within it, and so severs the connection between themselves and the rest of humanity. The old self, its memories, emotional responses, and assumptions about the world are obliterated as the construction of a new self must take place. Brison argues the traumatized must integrate the traumatic event into a new narrative with a before or after, or before and after, meaning you create a new narrative which integrates this event. I'm going to do the rest on Ainsley's session with me, and I have Ainsley's permission, so I'm just going to continue. Something which I talked about with Ainsley, or tried to implement as my idea of negative psychoanalysis, was this idea of reconstructing the self, forming a new narrative where the other was cut. Meaning that when an accident breaks the old narrative self, a new narrative must take place, which either integrates the event into a new narrative self, or as Malabou argues, it could be a complete break where integration is impossible, or the patient becomes apathetic to their old life. I felt that this view of reconstructing this of the self could be seen as something somewhat empowering, such as how Nietzsche viewed the destruction of the self as something empowering or redeeming. As we see in his comments, that's how the overman comes about, or as Spielrein discusses the child as the higher. But I'll discuss that more later. Ainsley gave me an opportunity to talk about this when she told me she was worried about change, that she was worried about our friends leaving for their Erasmus years. I felt this idea of change was something to be looked into further, and thought that possibly talking about it could alleviate some of Ainsley's worries about change. And knowing that Ainsley was American, I decided to talk to her about her life before Ireland, and the obviously big change that came involved with her moving from America to Ireland. But I hadn't quite realised just how much change Ainsley had gone through or subjected herself to. For example, I didn't realise that Ainsley was from the Appalachians, which is a very rural area. Ainsley's description of Appalachia and the Appalachians only highlighted how big of a change it was for Ainsley to go to university in America. The college Ainsley went to in America was an historically women's college, and Ainsley commented about how different it was to her home, with the presence of many different types of people, different LGBT groups, etc., and how much she enjoyed that for a time. Ainsley's next big change was moving to Ireland. Here she made a big life change as she decided to stay in Cork after her Erasmus year in Ireland. I feel that these shifts involve a destruction of herself or her linear narrative in some way, a destruction of her old life in the Appalachians, and then a destruction of her old university life. Oh, I forgot to change the title of that. During the session, Ainsley repeatedly marked how different she was from before. To such an extent that when Ainsley returned to the men that came into the outdoor sporting goods store that she worked at would look at her funny, as they weren't used to seeing someone like Ainsley in this area, such as Ainsley's hair and her earrings and stuff. These comments by Ainsley reminded me of the Ontology of the Accident by Catherine Malabou, where she quotes Spinoza, who says that the human being can change into another nature, which is very different from its own. And that when a man suffers such change that it is not easy for me to say that he's the same person. Spinoza uses the example of a poet who, after suffering an accident, didn't believe his poems were his own. What particularly stood out while doing this section was Ainsley's description of returning to her childhood bedroom after her Erasmus year in Ireland. This again reminded me of Spinoza and a quote that says, what shall we say of infants? A man of mature years thinks their nature to be so different from his own that he could be persuaded he was never an infant. I also saw in Ainsley's construction of this narrative the same redemption through destruction I saw in Spielrein, or redemption through creation, and Nietzsche. Oh yeah, with Spielrein and Nietzsche, with Nietzsche's talk about the overman. I see this kind of vaguely, but through Ainsley's description first of the Appalachia's rural mountain region to our American university, which she describes as still small, suggesting that Cork, while still a small city, was a progression or a step forward. Firstly, the similarities between Malabou and Brison is that the Malabou offers like a much more in-depth look at the argument laid forth in Brison's Outliving Oneself, that an accident or traumatic event can break the old self, creating a new self which is a stranger to the one before. Then identity metamorphs when a trauma alters emotional affects. Where the works differ is Malabou's discussion of the coldness or indifference that takes the place of sorrow. Here, Malabou argues that the individual's history is completely cut after a traumatic event, that the old identity is impossible to reappropriate. It is unable to be captured through language, that these accidents don't allow for justification, and they can't be recalled through memory. Here, Malabou discusses what she characterizes as destructive plasticity, where coldness and indifference often create a change without redemption. The idea of change without redemption is where my views are parted from Malabou's. I find that Malabou's ideas of a change without redemption are just kind of on a feeling aspect. I just find it very depressing. I feel that this redemption narrative that I saw in Nietzsche and Spielrein is something important and therapeutic. However, I also would disagree with Brison in that I would argue that these events are actually uncapturable by language. We see this in comments by people such as Charlotte Delbo, who, after surviving Auschwitz, commented that she does not recognize the self that was in Auschwitz, to the extent that she was never there at all, showing that Delbo could not capture her trauma through language, that she couldn't integrate the traumatic episode into a life with a before and after, as Brison had suggested. Malabou also discussed Freud's version of plasticity, one different from her destructive plasticity, that a subject must be able to give up former investments desired differently, allowing mobility for someone to be transformed without being destroyed. This idea of Freud's made me think that possibly this coldness, apathy, and memory loss could be viewed as a form of redemption in itself. Another person discussed I thought that maybe this coldness could be seen as redeeming in itself, that the coldness allows the individual to overcome what happened. It could be constructed that way or seen that way, similar to how the higher child or the overman is discussed in Spielrein's essay. I wasn't convinced by Malabou's argument and feel that this idea or illusion of redemption could be seen as therapeutic for the patient. Ainsley's session was my first. Oh yeah, this is the next one. Ainsley's session was my first attempt at analyzing someone. I also had no real idea what negative psychoanalysis is and what negative psychotherapy would look like, so I decided to go off what I had learned from Brison and Spielrein. I feel like in retrospect may not have been the best idea, that the theories are too exact or precise, and in that no person could tell me exactly what I wanted to hear or exactly what I heard in Brison. Also, it made me avoid something that was quite important to Ainsley, which is her religion, which I only approached when I ran out of ideas with my own plan. As I said in another session, religion hasn't held much interest for me in my study or my life. But I feel if it was important to Ainsley, that probably should have taken precedent. I also took the requirement of giving no advice as meaning no interjection, which I think may have been an all right way to take it, as me putting forward my theory might have the effect of leading her to my already decided conclusion. However, I still hold the belief in this redemption narrative being an empowering idea for the patient, that this idea of overcoming should be encouraged. And to do that, I would have to interject, so there's a bit of a contradiction there. Also, probably due to knowing Ainsley beforehand, I had a real urge not to pry into her life. And something missing from my session is what Brison's, an important part of Brison's work is trauma. Ainsley didn't really want to say too much in that regard, and I didn't really want to ask. Feel like in terms of friendship, that would kind of be a good move, but as a counsellor, I think you have to be a bit more bold. I feel that destructivity discussed in Spielrein's work still applies to Ainsley, as she has made a large amount of changes. Not these changes have been creative and a new life, as I said earlier. Anxiety and advice. Whenever Ainsley first began talking about her worry about changes and her fear of her friends leaving for their Erasmus years, my instant reaction was to try to cover up these fears by maybe giving a way to change her thinking. I felt at the time that offering these things and choosing to believe that they would work would kind of alleviate my own anxiety. Reflecting on this, I thought that maybe certain practices like CBT or saying that the subject's fears are wrong or beliefs are wrong or misguided may be a more sophisticated way of protecting ourselves from this anxiety, uncertainty, or negativity. Notes on negative psychoanalysis. Throughout the script, I've tried to kind of avoid words that are like good or positive when discussing my idea of redemption or the importance of the illusion of redemption when constructing your narrative self. Instead, I've opted to say things like empowering or important, as I believe the implementation of this illusion allows for a person to embrace destruction and the creation that comes with it. For example, I feel if I could have convinced Ainsley of the goodness of previous changes, the idea of overcoming, then she would embrace these future changes that she was worried about. It didn't really work out in the session itself, as I didn't want to really interject. And then I also felt that Ainsley didn't really fit the theory that I had very exactly, but I don't think anybody really could. My idea going in that possibly negative psychotherapy could encourage this kind of destructivity that Spielrein discusses ultimately wasn't very negative, and I feel it couldn't really properly fit into what negative psychotherapy would look like, because I find it, it wasn't very negative. It kind of seemed like the old way of doing things. Right, that's my section done.